I'll be over there. I'll cue you, but I think we'll just about be ready to go as soon as I get over there.
Okay.
All good?
Yeah, what's your sign again?
Hold and then go.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. CMC connects people and ideas through community conversations at forums just like this nearly every week. I'm Niele Juris, the Senior Director of Communications and Engagement for the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, also known as MORPC. I'm also proud to serve as a member of CMC's Board of Trustees. For those of you joining us by live stream, we're coming to you from our home in Columbus's historic Italian village, the Ellis. For those of you here, if you can scan the QR codes at your tables, you can learn more about today's forum. Take a short survey and see how many organizations support your not-for-profit Columbus Metropolitan Club. We would like to take a moment to thank today's forum sponsors, Homeport and the Robert Weiler Company, Steptoe and Johnson, and our forum partner, the League of Women Voters of Metropolitan Columbus. Let's give them a round of applause. We're also grateful to the presenting sponsor of our live stream, the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation, and our live stream partner, the Columbus Dispatch, and thank you to the Ellis for hosting us once again. Another round of applause. Every CMC forum takes a village. Let's thank everyone supporting today's program. As our country heads into a pivotal election, today we unpack the creation and the legacy of one of the most significant legislative achievements in American history, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Bold, imperfect act creation, and at times deemed controversial, the Civil Rights Act demanded a fundamental fairness in American life that today remains an unfinished task. With our panelists, we pay respects to the vision of the Civil Rights Act and take stock of the state of civil liberties in today's America. We're thrilled to welcome today's distinguished panelists. We have Janet E. Jackson, former president and CEO of the United Way of Central Ohio, former city attorney for the city of Columbus, and former Franklin County Municipal Court judge. We have Dr. Hassan Kwame Jeffries, associate professor with the Department of History at The Ohio State University. And we have Jen Miller, executive director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio. Our host for today is Kay Wilson, associate publisher, editor-in-chief, and partner with Mahogany Magazine. Kay, welcome to CMC. We look forward to today's conversation. The podium is all yours.
Thank you, Niele. So today, a more abiding commitment to freedom, a more constant pursuit of justice, a deeper respect for human dignity. These were the promises of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as expressed by Lyndon B. Johnson when he signed the bill into law. This marks the 60th anniversary of that landmark legislation, but the journey towards racial justice in the United States is older than the nation itself, and nowhere near complete. No issue in history has met more resistance in the United States Congress than civil rights. The first Civil Rights Act, which established full citizenship for formerly enslaved Americans, was vetoed twice by President Andrew Jackson. Congress finally overrode the veto with a 2/3 majority in each chamber, allowing the bill that supported the 13th Amendment to become law. Our abiding commitment to freedom is undermined by discriminatory voter ID laws, gerrymandering, the shuttering of polling places in predominantly minority neighborhoods, limits on early voting, and reckless purging of voter polls. Our pursuit of justice is derailed by persistent racism in policing and sentencing, the dismantling of diversity and inclusion policies in employment and education, and lack of access to financial services, housing, and healthcare. Our respect for human dignity is called into question by unraveling nets, a poverty-level federal minimum wage, and other economic policies that uplift the wealthy at the expense of working families. For Black America, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the first time that United States government addressed the racial caste system that had been protected for centuries by unjust laws and systemic brutality of non-white people in this country. The law, in many ways, answered the calls for jobs and freedom in the March on Washington by banning discrimination in the workplace, in our housing system, and programs funded by the government, and marked the death of the Jim Crow South. 60 years later, the fight for equality is far from over. We have a Supreme Court that has dismantled affirmative action, threatened not only equitable access to higher education and the economic opportunities born from a college degree, but also endangering diversity and equity initiatives that make our workplaces safer and more accessible for people from all backgrounds. We have states not only dictating who gets to vote in elections, but also enforcing ID laws and requirements that make it harder for marginalized people to participate in the democratic process. We also have changes in academic curriculum and banning of diverse parts of American history that intentionally perpetrate ignorance among voters. I am very proud to be with you today, and I have a couple questions for our panelists. So the questions for all of you I'd like you to answer: how would you assess the progress made in the United States regarding civil rights and equality since the passage of the Civil Rights Act 60 years ago?
I'm going to start. But I'm first going to give you some background about me that most of you don't know. I know there's one dear friend in the audience, Mr. Shoemate, the person who hired me back in 1977 in the AG's office. I am not from Ohio. I am from rural, southern, segregated Virginia. My home is approximately 100 miles south of Richmond. I attended an all-Black elementary school, but that was the law in Ohio. And 1 year after this act was passed, I started high school as an 8th grader. I am one of the first Blacks to integrate an all-white school system. I had the experience for 3 years of being the only Black child riding a school bus for an hour each way, each day, driven by a student bus driver. Until recently, I shared an experience, and I will always say it was the one time that I almost gave up. And the person corrected me and said, "No, Janet, you took control of your personal safety." Because when I was in the 9th grade on that bus, there was a white male student who was leaving, who took his stack of books and connected them with my head. I never told my parents what was happening on that school bus. There wasn't anything they could do about it. But I went home that night and I said to my mom, I explained everything, and I said, "I'm going to withdraw. I want to go to the all-Black high school, Central." And she took me to the principal, who had interviewed me to even go to this high school, and had said to me, "Well, you've done well in this system," meaning the Black system. "Let's see what you do in yours." Well, guess what? When he pulled out my grades, they were the same. And he says, "Miss Jackson, Mrs. Jackson, please don't withdraw her." He says, "Let me try to handle this." And he did. So I lived this in a very rural way, because many times we look at Montgomery and Selma, Memphis, and other places. But this was, be clear, I was raised on a red clay tobacco growing farm. And most of you just don't know of those experiences. There are a few in the room, maybe from your parents, or others. So I would say that in terms of the impact on me and others in the country, There were radical positive changes that occurred for so many years. And we could go down, the list, public accommodations, schools. But like you said in your remarks, I am terribly frightened by what I see now. I had a habit of watching CBS Sunday Morning. And if anyone watched it this past week, there was a story on there. And yes, it was connected to a certain person's campaign that just frightened me when I heard what people were saying. Essentially, not calling for another insurrection, but calling for war, another civil war. So we could go through the good things, but as you said, and even today, and it wasn't so much about this act, I quickly had a chance to look at the dispatch. There's a story that says Ohio is one of the worst states in the country when it comes to LGBTQ. It was like, we're like number 4 from the bottom or whatever. So we still have much work to do in every single category, education, employment, just everything. Sorry for the long answer, but I had to share that story with you today.
I'm glad you shared that story, because it's a story that's too often untold of the generation of young people who actually move into these desegregated, ostensibly desegregated schools. We imagine, or we tell ourselves, that the Civil Rights Act is passed, the Voting Rights Act is passed, but especially 10 years after Brown, that schools desegregate, then everything is fine, right? Black students move in, everything is cool, we turn our heads, and no, that generation, your generation of students, caught hell in going through these schools. And it's a wonder that anyone was able to survive in those schools going forward. So that's a critically important story. 20 years later, not in rural Virginia, but in Brooklyn, New York, I began high school in a school that had a population of about larger than my college, some almost 4,000 students, that was on the surface integrated. It was 60% African American, 40% white or so, but within the school itself was rigidly segregated, resegregated. So you had a zone school that was drawing upon a majority African American, majority Caribbean community, and you had a magnet schools, magnet programs within that school that was 90% white. So 20 years later, my brother and I are in these medical science, humanities magnet programs in an ostensibly desegregated school, but we're the only Black students in our classes as well. And so when we think about progress, we have to get away from another American myth, and that is the myth of perpetual progress, that things always get better in America when it comes to race, that is somehow linear, when in fact it's much more nuanced, it's much more complicated. Things, when we look at American history, we're often thinking about racial progress as really more of a flat line rather than a straight line up that's periodically interrupted with peaks and often deep valleys. And I would argue we're in one of these moments now where we're moving into, if we're not already there, in one of these deep valleys when it comes to these issues.
Thank you for that. It kind of goes along. I was going to start by saying that the impacts of the Voting Rights Act in democracy were immediate. So right after the Voting Rights Act passed, for example, the DOJ was able to stop a massive voter purge of Latino voters in Texas. These are purges we still see. We saw profound increase in voter registration rates, in turnout and representation across the country, but especially in the South. And now it's happening. Voting is the tip of the spear in many ways. It is our first right. It is preservative and protective of all other rights. And so not surprisingly, but absolutely distressingly, we're backsliding significantly. So what are some of those things? We still have voter purges. In fact, there's one going on right now here in Ohio, And I encourage all of you to have you and all of your friends check the registration reset list to see if you're on there. I will tell you that in 2019, we were looking through, for the first time ever, Secretary LaRose, the first time ever in the history of purging, which has been done by Republican and Democrat Secretaries of State, Secretary LaRose made that list public in 2019. And we found about 40,000 individuals who should not have been on the list. There were actually clerical errors by two of the voter registration vendors, well, one voter registration vendor at two different systems in counties across the state. So there are a lot of mistakes done on these, and we don't always agree with Secretary LaRose, but I do want to continue to at least thank him for making this public. He's done it again. So one of the things League is doing is we're going through that list just to see if there are anomalies that we're concerned about. But the other thing is make sure everyone's registered to vote. Make sure that your registration is up to date. We now have the strictest voter ID, or one of the strictest voter ID laws in the country here in Ohio, and it is profoundly disenfranchising veterans, people with disabilities, youth, especially out-of-state students, as well as people of color, unhoused, low-income individuals. About 11% of Ohioans don't have the ID needed to vote. Racial gerrymandering is back. Gerrymandering in general never stopped. Voter intimidation and threats and violence against election officials. You know, these are old playbooks where they would, in the South, of course, bring law enforcement, or potentially in Ohio, law enforcement to the polls to intimidate people. Intimidation is not new. Unfortunately, it has continued to grow through, with 2020 and beyond, through the election. So see, these are some of the things that are before us. And I'm sorry to say something so downer, because the reality is that they're using playbooks that they've always used to be anti-voter in their policies. We've got playbooks too, and I'm looking forward to talking about our collective action together.
Thank you. So Judge Jackson, thank you for the story that you shared earlier. From your experience in the judiciary, how have civil rights laws evolved to address contemporary issues of discrimination and inequality? And what legal gaps do you think still exist?
Well, certainly over a number of years, there were executive orders and other things that from the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, maybe a landmark one more recently were the rights of the LGBTQ. So things kept being, positive. Not everything was taken care of in 1964. And certainly we made grounds. And we also had setbacks, certainly. Again, going back to my experience, and this is a Supreme Court case that I think was decided in 1977 or 78, the Bakke decision. I was one of those students who benefited from George Washington University because they had a certain number of seats set aside for African Americans, for Native Americans, for Hispanics to go to law school. And we are seeing more and more of those types of laws being ruled, unconstitutional, et cetera. I have such a history with CMC because I used to be on the board and I'm a lifelong member. And I think one of the rules was we really couldn't talk about politics. But I don't see how we can have this discussion today and not touch on it, a little bit. This Supreme Court is horrible. And it might, even get any worse. So I just see more impediments to where we need to go. It's tough to be positive right now.
Thank you. Dr. Jeffries, as a professor at The Ohio State University, how do you see the impact of Civil Rights Act on educational access and equity for students of color? And what more do you think can be done to ensure inclusive representation in higher education?
A lot more can be done. How much can be done, given this particular court, is yet to be determined. I'll circle back to Ohio State in a second, but I think it is important to say a word about the current Supreme Court and just thinking about the Supreme Court as a whole. Like, I mean, it goes back to this idea of, these myths that circulate in our society about sort of the courts and the Supreme Court. It's really on the side of justice. Actually, when you sort of look at the history of the Supreme Court, it's like 20 years. The Warren Court, from sort of Brown to Roe, right, the 50s to the early 70s, where you actually have the Supreme Court working and handing down rulings that are supportive of civil rights and civil liberties and really expanding and strengthening them. That's 20 years. The rest of the history of the Supreme Court is actually actively working against supporting basic civil rights and civil liberties, working actively against people of color, working actively against women. So the moment that we are in now is more the norm than the exception. And I think we have to keep that in mind as we're fighting the court, as we're fighting to promote these issues of equity, because it's going to be an uphill climb, because it always has been. Ohio State University has room to improve. It always has had room to improve, and it has improved. If we look at its most recent history, though, it hasn't done enough because it hasn't been willing to fight hard enough. In the early 2000s, there were a couple cases that came out of Michigan and Texas that dealt with affirmative action, in which the Supreme Court said you can't lean as hard into sort of race as you have it in the past. It didn't say you couldn't consider it with regard to admissions and programs. It said you just can't quantify. You can't lean into it as much. Ohio State University, like many other universities around the country, afraid of being sued. I don't know why, they got lots of money. Afraid of being sued, sort of pulled back and said, all right, we're not gonna lean into this as much, when it didn't have to. And as a result, specifically as it related to African-American attendance enrollment at Ohio State, it went from around 15%, which is reflective of the state average, more or less in terms of population, to 5%. To 5%. And that's 7 or 8 years before the anti-affirmative action ruling that we just got. So the question is, we've already seen a precipitous decline in enrollment, even before this anti-DEI wave, anti-affirmative action wave going forward. So the question will become, like, look, the trend is not in the right direction. So what is this university, what is this administration going to do to make sure that its flagship university is actually open to all of its residents, is actually open to all of its citizens, right, and is reflective of the state as a whole? I am deeply concerned that we will not do enough, but I am hopeful to be proven wrong.
Yeah. So Jen, in your role, how have voting rights and participation among marginalized communities improved or regressed since the Civil Rights Act? And what initiatives are currently being undertaken to combat voter suppression?
Well, that's a gigantic question that I could take the entire hour for, but a few things. Let's talk about the 2004 election here in Ohio. At that point, I actually worked at the King Arts Complex, but I was an election protection poll monitor. And I went to a place on the South Side that I had voted in 2000. And I noticed that there were so many fewer machines. And what did we find out in this process? We found out that the average Black or brown precinct in Cleveland and Columbus had they had 17 less machines than 2000. And the white precincts had 8 more. And so the league, and actually I was not really even really aware of the league or ACLU that much at that point. I should not, I mean, I used the league voter guide, but I didn't know all the other awesome stuff they did. And I was a little bit of a fan of ACLU, but at that point, the league and ACLU filed a lawsuit. And the first thing that happened that doesn't seem that exciting was there was a requirement for election administration plans. Boards of elections had to make public their plans. So we could decide if they were adequate and fair. There's a lot of other things that happened in lawsuits that League, ACLU, NAACP, others were a part of. This is when we got early voting. This is when we got no excuse absentee voting. We saw a large expansion of access here in Ohio. But since then, we have now had 458, which has been the broadest change to election laws in Ohio since 2004, and is the opposite direction. So now absentee voting, it's cut only by 1 day, but the schedule is so confusing. The last week of early vote, the hours are literally different day by day. Confusion is the enemy of turnout, always, right? Absentee voting is now shorter, now harder. We have, again, the strictest voter ID. So we took away a lot of alternative ideas. We even took away county veteran IDs. So now you can only have a U.S. veteran ID card or a Ohio or an active military card. So we took away county veteran IDs, which was way a lot of people with disabilities, a lot of senior citizens, a lot of low-income folks. I point that out because of who we're trying to talk to about the problem with voter ID, right? How shameful to make it harder for someone who served our country to vote. So there was a lot of things that happened there. Right now, how are we fighting suppression? One, unfortunately, I'd love to say it's all offense and we're just trying to get these bills, all these rules changed to be more, to have better access. Unfortunately, it's not the case. Right now, there is a bill in the Ohio State House that very much concerns me. It would actually make ID even stricter. It would make it very easy, much easier for someone to question the eligibility of another voter, making it really simple paperwork. Right now, it has to be someone from your county and they can only fill out one person per form. Now it could be any registered voter in Ohio, in any Ohio county, and they can use that form to write up as many questions of voter eligibility as they have. So could just be looking at the line and deciding how they think people vote or what they look like and start questioning them. There would be a requirement for poll workers to look at the ID and look at the voter and see if they present the same. So that's anti-transgender, but also think about people who've had a serious illness or a disability. There are many, many other provisions in here that are profoundly scary. So first and foremost, what they do really well is they keep us on the defense so that it's hard to also have an offense. But we're vigilant on that. We're working with allies on that. Thankfully, there were supposed to be hearings this week. They're not there. I expect this in lame duck. So if you start hearing a 5-alarm fire from us after the election and we need y'all to weigh in, that's why, okay? And real quickly, gerrymandering. Here's our offense. So the Citizens Not Politicians Amendment has multiple pieces in there. Of course, first and foremost, let's talk about the fact that if it's not politicians, it's probably already going to be more racially and gender diverse. But we know it will be, right? Because that's part of it, that we would have a diversity of regions and ages and skill sets and races and religions. It also has a provision that is about prison gerrymandering, which I'm very proud of. That'll be hard to implement, but it would make prison gerrymandering illegal. And it would once again uphold the right of minority voters to have representation that looks like them in areas where we have large voting blocks of Black and brown voters. So there's a lot that we can do together.
So, Dr. Jeffries, what specific initiatives or programs has The Ohio State University implemented to promote diversity and inclusion, and how effective do you feel these measures have been?
Well, the measures over the last 20, 25 years, or the last 60 years have been critically important, including programs that reach out to students before they are even enrolling or applying to Ohio State, statewide programs that reach out to high school students. These types of targeted programs that are connected previously under the Hale Center Office of Diversity and Inclusion, Office of Minority Affairs, have been effective in diversifying and bringing in qualified students of color to Ohio State University. We know what programs work. When we don't pretend as though race isn't real and race doesn't exist, and we target specific groups in specific communities, guess what? They come to Ohio State University. We know what works. We've had the programs on the ground and they've been effective. Two things I think that are critically important to keep in mind going forward. One, these programs, almost all of them, including sort of what is now the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, was the Office of Minority Affairs, were born out of student struggle, student demands at The Ohio State University, going back to the late 60s, early 70s. Every generation of students have been pushing for a more equitable, more accessible university. So it's not like the university is just coming around like, hey, what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? No, they're responding very often to students. I wouldn't be at Ohio State if it wasn't for students at Ohio State creating a space to bring in and hire African-American faculty and faculty of color. So the student impetus, the student strength is critically important, and student involvement in diversifying the university has been critical, is too often overlooked. It's also important that administrations get behind it. And we have a new administration at Ohio State now. They're feeling the pressure from the state legislature. They've turned DEI into a negative word, a negative frame. So how is the administration going to respond? What are they going to do? Are they going to stand up? Or are they going to sit down and be quiet? I don't know. He's supposed to be a military guy, so hopefully he's going to stand up. But we'll see. But that's what we need. We need an administration to stand up with students and demand the kind of university that we deserve, so that we can move forward into the 21st century. We know how to do it. It's just a matter of, do we have the will to do it?
Thank you. So, Judge Jackson, I know that you are a mentor to many here in Central Ohio, and I want you to share a little bit about a landmark case that you presided over that reflects the ongoing struggle for civil rights, and also how you have helped shape understanding for those who are coming behind you about their responsibility when they sit in the seat of a judge.
We have to remember that I was a member of the Franklin County Municipal Court, so didn't really have any of those cases coming before me. My experience in this area is more of a trial lawyer, because my very first position here with the Attorney General, William J. Brown, was in the civil rights section. So, and again, that's something that people probably didn't know. So it was still my first love after all of these years, but to be able, and I use the term prosecute, even though these were civil cases, and you name it, I did it. Race, sex, handicap. I'm probably one of the first trial lawyers to handle a sexual harassment case. So for me, it was just in me in terms of the practice of law, never having had the opportunity. And I think typically those would be more federal judges, and you talk about those landmark cases. I do spend a lot of time with our younger folk. I'm not talking about the 21-year-olds. I'm talking 40 to 55. They come to, some of them know that, they come to Miss Janet's sofa. Many of them are office holders. Some lead nonprofits. But the mentoring part comes in when I try to impart to them what their role is in this community. And especially with our youngest citizens. Before the Ohio State, University, as a pro-wit grad would say. What's your role in impacting their lives? Because many of us had role models, people certainly who work with us, but I have to admit, I'm not seeing as much of that as I would like, to see. So one of my challenges to those of you sitting in this audience is make time with at least one. They don't have to be elected officials. Our young people still struggle in private employment. How do I make it working for corporation, whatever. The individual struggle for not only acceptance, but to truly be all that you can be. It's very challenging for our young people. And I think we think, oh, they've got it. This is 2024, life is whatever. It's not for so many of them. So what's going to be your role in helping them along that journey?
Thank you. So at this time, Columbus Metropolitan Club usually has an age-old tradition of audience members who are able to ask questions. And so if you do have a question, Doug is standing by the microphone. You can make your way over there. And for our panelists, I have one last question that I am going to ask. So looking ahead, what do you believe are the most critical actions needed from the legal system, the educational institutions, and civic organizations to continue advancing civil rights and ensuring equity and equality for all Americans?
Vote, vote, vote. And especially this year, in Ohio and throughout the nation, because without, and I'm so proud to be a member of the League of Women Voters, without that, I just see us continuing, not to slide, to rapidly descend into unacceptable behaviors.
Dr. Jeffers?
Voting is absolutely critical. That's something that we all can do, should do, have to do, but we also have to organize. League of Women Voters, ACLU of Ohio. We have to be on the ground making sure that we're doing the litigation, we're doing the lobbying that is critically important. We're in a moment where when we think about those who are opposed to extending and supporting basic civil rights and human rights are sort of responding, and it's sort of a backlash moment. No, you have those who, for them, they're attempting a course correction, right? That goes back to 1964, right? That they feel that the 1964 Civil Rights Act is unfair and unjust and should never have been passed. That the 1965 Voting Rights Act should never have been passed. This is why you got Shelby versus Holder, Supreme Court rolling that back. Roe versus Wade overturned. You don't think that they're coming for the 1964 Civil Rights Act? You don't think they're not coming for the Brown decision? That is all on the table now. And so, it is going to take voting, but we have to do more than that. Voting is essential, but it's also not enough. Why? Because of the gerrymandering, because of the voting ID and all these other mechanisms that have diluted the strength and the power of the vote. So we have to do that. That is absolutely critical, but it's going to take more than that. It's going to take active organizing through organizations that are already doing this work to support them so that we can create the change that we need and be at the forefront of this fight today.
And that includes fighting complacency. I think that's one of our greatest challenges right now. It's like things are all good, I've got mine. And we individually, I have challenging conversations with family members, and friends about, you need to do this, fighting that complacency.
Go ahead.
Just on the complacency, that is so critically important, because one of the things that we say to ourselves, right, to rationalize our complacency and complicity is we say, well, look, time will take care of this. Right? Let's just allow time to pass and things will get better. Time is not a social force capable of creating change. If you allow time to just simply pass, what will happen? Nothing. The status quo will be reinforced. So that complacency allows, we tell ourselves that, time will take care of this, right? We just got to give it. No. We're seeing with the passage of time, other folk will be mobilizing, will lose those gains and those rights. Nothing is guaranteed. We've seen that. So we have to be active.
And I'm just going to jump in on some of that voter complacency. I think the two biggest enemies of turnout, first still is confusion, but the second is feeling hopelessness or feeling like my vote doesn't count. So on the first, please make sure you check in on everyone. Everyone needs to review their voter plan because voter logistics have changed significantly. Young people regularly don't even realize there's a voter registration deadline, okay? So check in, make your own voting plan, check in with all your loved ones, those who may have mobility challenges, young people, whoever it is. That's number one. Number two, let's talk about what's on the ballot beyond the top of the ticket, like local judges. The drop-off from who votes at the very bottom of the ticket, who affects us daily, right? Like all of us will go before a local judge. Might be for traffic, might be for an employment issue, might be for a family issue. But we can help people understand their power when we help them research their ballot, but not just who's on the ballot, the jobs of those folks. And I think that is one thing we can do. And of course, I'm just going to ask you to vote for citizens, not politicians, because it's the first step of many here in Ohio.
So thank you to all the panelists. It has been both my honor and delight to share this moment with you. So thank you. And now Doug Buchanan with CMC is curating questions from our live stream audience.
Kay, thank you very much. And thank you to today's panelists. If for those of you in the room, if you have a question to ask today's extraordinary panelists, please do come line up here behind me. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. If you're watching on the live stream, please type your questions into the chat. We'll also try to get to those. Do keep in mind, great questions at CMC have two things in common. They take 30 seconds or less to ask, and they end in a what? Thank you. So we have some return guests. They do end in a question mark. Thank you. So here's the first question. A past Civil Rights Act was designed to protect all citizens in their civil and legal rights, provide equal treatment in public accommodation and public transportation, and prohibited exclusion from jury service. It was never enforced, and parts of it were later declared unconstitutional. It was the last Civil Rights Act for the next 82 years. I'm referring to the 1875 Civil Rights Act. What does it say about our messy democracy that we create aspirational laws with good intentions, but then take decades, even centuries, to live up to them?
Yeah, I know. Let the historian answer that, right? I mean, you just defined America, right? I mean, again, the mythology in America is that it's sort of this notion of perpetual progress. Things may have been bad ones. We had slavery, but we fought a civil war. We put some laws on the books during Reconstruction. We had Jim Crow, but we're not really going to say what that is, but we got Martin Luther King. Then we got Barack Obama, and now we got Beyonce doing country music. Things always get better, perpetual progress. But the reality is, there's these moments, right? The moments of actual progress are really small, right? There's short time periods, and then there's a push hard against them. So you're right. We get the Reconstruction, we get the Reconstruction amendments, we get the major civil rights legislation coming out of the Reconstruction period, and they aren't simply just not enforced. They're actively worked against. I mean, the Supreme Court actively works against. Right, saying, nope, they're not going to apply this. You get Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. You get Slaughter. I mean, so these things don't accidentally go away, right? There are efforts to undermine them. Roe didn't just fall out of favor. Roe was actively undermined, right? I mean, and it took 50 years, 49 years, but they didn't give up over those 49 years dealing with. So that is actually the history of America. And I think the sooner we deal with that and accept that, I think the better off we will be, and we'll be able to strategize around protecting and expanding democracy in a better way, the sooner we realize that that history is actually the history that we're dealing with.
My name is Tom Wiebel. I came to this city in 1968 as a radio news director, and I was hosting conversations like this quite often and experienced some things that I don't even really want to remember. We're getting there, I guess. The smartest thing I ever did was adopt that moderator right over there. I'm her dad. Quick question. The quick question I have is, as a longtime news person in this area, how have the media done in the coverage of these issues?
I guess I'll start. So I think I consider the media a very important partner to the league, since the league doesn't endorse candidates and doesn't take stances, on a lot of things, and never is a lot of rules similar, actually, to reporters. So informed voters. That doesn't mean I think the media do everything right, but I think here in Ohio, we need to thank and support our local media. They're often in places where we aren't, and they do a really good job demystifying a lot of issues. And so I would encourage all of us to make sure that we are having a healthy media diet, a diverse media diet, so we're not hanging out in echo chambers. And that we also participate by even writing letters to the editors and op-eds and things like that, because the media matters. And without the media, I think it's much harder for all the rest of us to do our job.
I have a slightly different view.
Me too.
I wouldn't say it was I'm just going to say, Judge, I don't think that was my complete view, but I wanted to, but yeah, go at it.
Sometimes I just wonder what has happened to true journalism, especially when I'm watching local news. It's a repeat of the same thing over and over and over. It's more about traffic and weather. Where are the meaty kind of stories around this? But then I'll also go to the national news. I start watching news at 6:30 in the morning, and I try to go through 11. I'm an MSNBC watcher. Did I really need to listen to you day after day for how many weeks talk about that trial? Weren't there other important things going on in the world that we wanted and needed, to know about? There are shows, certainly, and I mentioned it earlier, Meet the Press. Sometimes she annoys me because she talks over people, but she's not going to let you get away with not answering the question, as I saw on Sunday. So you really have to search it out. I'm not saying that it's not, but it's getting, and I'll even use local names. So our dear friend Angela Pace left the news years ago, and we have Colleen Marshall, who is, again, one of those reporters who's going to really go after things. But I'm not satisfied with news coverage in this country.
I actually think these two things connect directly, which is that a lot of the TV and radio news was based on newspaper investigations, and our newsrooms are so small now. And that's part of the reason why I'm saying we have to support media, and I can just say that I see reporters really caring about the work that they do. And so I think they're connected completely.
Still subscribe to the Dispatch and read it every single day.
Yay.
Online.
Next question.
Thank you. Kimberly Cole on the live stream asks, how do the challenges of perpetual discrimination as discussed today influence decisions in our city's public school system, most recently the school closing recommendations?
One of the things that we did not do a good job of coming out of the era of school desegregation is look at the ways in which urban spaces outside the South, or just states outside the South, practiced intentional segregation. And so you have the Brown ruling in 1954. I ask my students all the time at Ohio State, what happened after the Supreme Court said segregation in education is unconstitutional? They're like, schools desegregated. I'm like, all of them? They're like, all of them. Like, really? No, nothing happens for 10 years. And then in another 10 years after that, Supreme Court says that you can have, in a case coming out of Milliken versus Bradley out of Detroit, that, you know, suburban school districts that don't have a history of explicit desegregation are not required to cooperate with desegregation plans involving resegregated urban school districts. So in other words, we have never done a good job of actively working to desegregate, actively working to create equitable schools outside the South. In many ways, and by the time you get to 1970s, 1980s, Southern school districts, previously rigidly segregated, are more desegregated, or doing a better job because they're under court orders than many school districts here in outside the South. Ohio is a little special, right, in Columbus, because of some very specific court orders that deal with the constitutional funding. So that's critical, but we haven't had the implementation. So the answer to the question is we can do better. We should do better, but we also have to realize that all of these school districts that we have, even just here in Central Ohio, they're imaginary. Right? But we draw these imaginary lines and say, oh no, this is Olentangy, this is going to be New Albany. That's just putting lines on a map that don't exist. If we were serious about having an equitable school district, then we would do away with all those lines and look at the ways in which all schools and all students can benefit from not just closing schools, not just privatizing schools, not just chartering schools, but funding and supporting and broadening out what we see as our public school base.
Good afternoon. My name is Raphael Davis Williams. I'm the Director of Equity, People, Inclusion, and Culture with the ACLU of Ohio. My question is specific to the United States and the lack of acknowledgement over the course of the history of our country to acknowledge the great divide between the races. And I reference countries like South Africa, Germany, who had really deep racial issues, but went through years of acknowledging that to move past it. And what level or what impact does the fact that we as a country have never even acknowledged? I think the closest we came was in 1990 something when President Clinton was in office, and I think he said, you know, he came close to saying it, and there was outrage then. How does that impact us when we think about all of the issues that we're facing, when we haven't simply acknowledged that there's a really huge divide in the country and make any efforts toward healing it?
Well, look at what's happening right now. I would say that the work that was started with DEI was trying to help us get there, but what's being happened? It's being dismantled already. You know, so after the death of Mr. Floyd, I could see here in Columbus companies that were beginning to embrace and to really work on these issues, and now they're backpedaling. They're walking away from it. It's no longer a priority, I think, throughout. I actually don't have an answer, you know, to your question. Like I said earlier, I'm quite dismayed at what's going on. Racism, sexism, homophobicism, alive and well. I mean, we have to acknowledge it. And then I would say, again, there's an individual responsibility around having tough conversations, you know, with individuals, you know, et cetera. But I actually don't know when we're going to get there, if ever.
And I think it's critically important as well to acknowledge that this isn't just sort of individual attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. I think the challenge comes in when we start talking about systems and structures. And what we saw in the summer of 2020 coming out of the George Floyd protests is millions of young people around the country demanding not just justice for the victims of police violence, but calling for an end to systemic racism. And that demand, an end to systemic racism, calling upon our nation's institutions and systems and structures to change fundamental practices, that's what shook a lot of people to the core. And that's the pushback that we're getting, because there's only two responses. If you're saying you got to end systemic racism, you can either do something to change the systems and structures of the way our society operate, or you do nothing because you are benefiting from the status quo. So what we're feeling right now, this attack on first critical race theory, then diversity, equity, inclusion, and women, I mean, all is because there are people who benefit from the status quo and don't want to see it change. And they're offering as a rationalization or justification for that, this idea that America is this beautiful place and there's never been any problems and we've gotten over them. That's why understanding this history is so critically important, because if you look at the history and when the kids see it, they see the history like, oh, we got to do better and we can do better. But when we ignore the history, then there's no incentive and you go along with this idea that there's no problems and we just need to forget about the past and move forward. We can't, because we're still being impacted by it and we have to change those systems and structures.
So I wish we had more time together. Thank you so much. I do hope that everyone does take an active role in not being complacent in the things we talked about today. So at this time, I will turn it back over to Niel Juris.
This forum could have probably went another hour. I was very much engaged. So I hope that you are all inspired from what you heard today, inspired to take bold, decisive action as we move forward. And we have to remain vigilant. And you heard our panelists say, vote, organize, but we have to be vigilant in protecting our civil liberties and our civil rights. So today, I want to thank our sponsors again, Homeport, the Robert Weiler Company, Steptoe and Johnson, and our forum partner, the League of Women Voters of Metropolitan Columbus. Thank you to the Ellis for hosting us, and to the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for supporting today's live stream, and a very, very special appreciation to our esteemed panelists, Janet E. Jackson, Dr. Hassan Kwame Jeffries, Jen Miller, and our host, Kay Wilson. Let's give them a round of applause. They definitely deserve a standing ovation. Next week's forum, CMC's annual State of Nonprofits, is sold out, but you can still join us online. And just a reminder, there is a venue change. It'll take place at the View, Columbus in the Brewery District, and we'll be back here at the Ellis on June 26th. So again, thank you, everyone. We cannot do this without you. Have a great afternoon.